Nancy Pelosi spent 40 years destroying careers with a smile, but it took Tulsi Gabbard exactly 15 seconds to shatter that legacy using nothing but a stack of declassified files. What unfolded inside that committee room was a brutal, surgical takedown, delivered entirely in the cold language of government records. It would take Pelosi 40 minutes to lose her legendary rhythm and 43 minutes to lose control of her own hands. But her fatal mistake happened the second the morning started. She walked in lecturing, when she really should have walked in ready to listen. Director Gabbard, with all due respect, Pelosi kicked off. She flashed that exact smile she had weaponized over 4 decades, the one engineered to tell people they were dead wrong while pretending to thank them. You have served this country honorably. The whole nation is grateful for your time in uniform. But military service is not the same thing as understanding. She angled herself slightly toward the broadcast cameras, playing directly to the voters watching on their living room screens in Ohio, Idaho, and the Carolinas. I would simply suggest that the rural myths about Washington have absolutely nothing to do with the heavy lifting of governing. The work I have directed, the work my colleagues have handled, the work that kept this republic standing, while soldiers like the director, however courageous, were deployed elsewhere. Tulsi Gabbard didn't instantly fire back. She sat dead still at the witness desk in a dark suit. A thin, red folder rested completely closed in front of her, both palms laid flat across it. 2 small, quiet service ribbons were pinned to her lapel. They were the only visual cues of where she had been before stepping into this chamber. She held the rigid posture of a military officer who had once stood at strict attention, holding a rifle in blistering heat for much longer than this opening speech. She wasn't bored. She was just waiting. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice was razor-sharp and totally flat, the strict cadence of an intelligence analyst delivering a brief. Madam Speaker, you just made 3 specific claims. You claimed service does not equal understanding. You claimed the voters watching at home live in a rural myth, and you claimed soldiers like me were elsewhere, while the actual work got done. She cracked the red folder open to the very first page. A heavy black declassification bar slashed diagonally across the header. The strict classification stamps were aggressively crossed out with one solid line. I will take each of those points in exact order, using official documents. I am not going to raise my voice. I won't have to. The truth this morning is entirely on paper. She planted her hand flat on the exposed document. You are standing at a microphone on the Capitol steps. You are the designated leader of the House Democratic Caucus, and you declare to the American public, quoting your exact words, that the intelligence community has spoken unequivocally regarding the matter of Russian interference. Do you recall making that statement? Madam Speaker? Pelosi's hand hadn't shifted yet. The conductor's right hand remained firmly in charge, hovering right below her chin. I remember guiding my caucus through a deeply turbulent era for this country, with the absolute gravity it demanded. Director, which is an entirely different matter than what you are. It is a very simple question. Did you state the intelligence community had spoken unequivocally? Yes or no? Yes. Within the framework of a period where... Thank you. Tulsi flipped the page. Then I am going to take you at your exact word, Madam Speaker. Before this hearing wraps up, I am going to expose to this committee what the intelligence apparatus actually stated in writing. Right when you were assuring the nation they had spoken without question, I am going to show you a manipulated intelligence process. Your own committee was caught orchestrating behind closed doors. I am going to show you a coordinated smear against a United States veteran that you had every chance to terminate with a single sentence, but actively chose not to. And when all of that is done, I am going to give you a specific number. She paused. She held the silence just long enough for the entire room to realize the pause was totally intentional. 70. The speaker's smile suddenly masked something else. It started running frantic calculations. If you just watched a sitting director of national intelligence crack open a red folder in front of a 4-decade political boss and promise her a devastating number, smash that like button right now. We are only on the first page. In the back rows, 11 men and women in plain, dark clothing sat completely motionless. They were military veterans, every single one of them, though no piece of apparel announced it. They had shown up for one specific reason and weren't totally sure yet if they would need to do anything but observe. For the absolute first time that morning, Nancy Pelosi's right hand drifted slowly downward, finally resting heavily on the leather-bound pad next to her elbow. "Carter Page is not the reason I am sitting at this table, Madam Speaker," Tulsi stated flatly. "He was just the easy excuse for someone else's morning show. The much harder reality is what actually occurred inside the rooms where these intelligence findings were drafted. So, that is exactly where we will begin." She pulled out the second document. The declassification strip across the top was thick and fresh. Throughout December 2016 and into January 2017, a small unit of analysts from the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was assigned to generate what we call an intelligence community assessment. It is the absolute highest-level unclassified report the IC releases. It is intended to represent the unified, analytic judgment of 3 distinct agencies. She read directly from the text. This is an internal email drafted by one of those exact analysts, dated the 4th of January 2017. The analyst explicitly writes, and I am quoting, that the underlying tradecraft does not support the level of confidence senior leadership has requested be assigned to the central judgment. She locked eyes with the panel. In plain English, Madam Speaker, they were explicitly instructed on what conclusions to draw before they even finished the investigation. A low murmur rippled across the press desks. This wasn't just one lone analyst complaining. There are 7 of them, spanning 2 separate agencies, documented right here in this folder. Their warnings were completely ignored. The confidence ratings were artificially upgraded. The report was pushed out. And less than 72 hours after it dropped, you were standing at that microphone on the Capitol steps, swearing to the country that the intelligence community had spoken without a single doubt. The exact phrase you deployed was, your words again, all roads lead to Russia. That was your catchphrase. That was your caucus catchphrase. That was the mandated talking point for 3 entire years. The judgment of the IC was the judgment of the IC director. I am not a... You used the word unequivocal. Tulsi's voice didn't rise, it just grew sharper. Unequivocal is a specific term with a specific definition, Madam Speaker. Unequivocal means undisputed. The report you cited was fiercely disputed, in writing, by the exact people who authored it, before it even left the building. You knew that. Or, to be perfectly precise, the official briefings provided to senior congressional leadership during that exact time frame are also sitting in this red folder, and they included the written dissents. I am not lecturing you on what you should have known. I am telling you exactly what was put right in front of you. Pelosi shifted slightly in her chair, almost imperceptibly. The conductor's hand was still planted on the memoir, but it had started to tap just once with the index finger. You ran the most powerful political caucus in the United States Congress, Madam Speaker, and in your hands, the careful, highly qualified, and internally disputed conclusion of a small group of intelligence analysts became on television a flawless, undeniable verdict. You were the amplifier. You didn't write the assessment. You never needed to. The country never read the actual assessment. The country simply watched you on those steps, and the country believed you, because for half a century you were the woman they had been told to believe. She placed the paper flat on the desk. Those analysts were treated as mere political assets in your party's calculus. They were not assets. They were sworn, professional officers of the United States government doing their job. You hijacked their findings and deliberately discarded their warnings. That is the very first thing I have on this paper this morning. The intelligence community is not above scrutiny. Director, I welcome a fulsome. I am not scrutinizing them, Madam Speaker. I am scrutinizing exactly what you did with them. That deafening silence is the distinct sound of a 4-decade speaker getting slammed with a brutal paper trail from her very own briefing archives. If a moment like that is worth your time, type the word asset in the comments so we know to keep driving forward. A reporter in the second row rapidly finished typing a sentence, read it once, grabbed her bag, and bolted for the rear doors. She did not return. Tulsi didn't even watch her go. She was already flipping to the third tab. Now, while that flawed assessment was being published, while you were on those marble steps, an entirely separate conversation was happening inside your speaker's office about a specific phone call. September of 2019, Madam Speaker. A complaint about a phone call between the American president and the president of Ukraine rapidly becomes the basis for the first impeachment of a sitting president in over 20 years. You ran that impeachment. You announced the inquiry. You stood right at a podium and said, quoting directly, that the truth was marching on. That was your line. That was the line of your floor leadership. That was, again, the line for the entire duration. She turned the page. And in the absolute earliest weeks of that inquiry, the chairman of the committee you handed it to, your colleague Mr. Schiff, stood at a microphone and was asked a plain question: had his staff had contact with the whistleblower before the complaint arrived? He said, no. It was not true. His staff had been in contact before the complaint. The House later censured him for it, formally by a hard-recorded vote of 213 to 209. 3 years later, after all the damage, she let that sit a moment. Now, Madam Speaker, I am not asking you to take responsibility for another member's words. I am asking about the machinery itself. Because the process was yours, you announced it, you assigned it, you defended it on every network in this country. And when, in the early weeks, the question was raised whether your designated chairman had been straight about the origins of the complaint, you stood squarely in front of the cameras, and you said, your exact words, that the question was, quote, beneath the dignity of this chamber. You called it a mere distraction. You said the truth was marching on. You shoved the process forward. She closed the tab and folded her hands on the cover. You didn't have to do that, Madam Speaker. You had options. You could have paused. You could have asked the questions. You could have demanded from your own committee chairman an honest answer the country deserved before the proceedings escalated. You actively chose not to. You chose to drive the train. And 3 years later, your own House voted on the record that the man at the front of that train had not told the truth about how it even left the station. Tulsi looked up. That is not partisan history. That is the recorded vote of the very chamber you presided over. She turned one more page, and there is one more thing the country was not told at the time. You did not put the impeachment inquiry to a formal vote of the full House when you announced it. You announced it entirely on your own authority, at a podium in the Capitol, on the 24th of September, 2019. Every prior modern impeachment inquiry, Nixon, Clinton, had begun with a concrete recorded vote authorizing the inquiry. You intentionally skipped that step. You did not give your own members the opportunity to be on the record, for or against, before the story took on the terrifying weight of an institutional proceeding. By the time the formal authorizing vote was held 5 weeks later, the country had been told for 35 solid days that the inquiry was completely real. That procedural shortcut was a choice, Madam Speaker. It was your choice. It is cemented in the parliamentary record of this House. Director, with all due, I would like to be extremely careful here, because I am a careful person, and the words matter. Tulsi did not interrupt loudly. She simply drove straight through. You didn't just bend a process, Madam Speaker. You actively blessed bending it. Every single time it served your caucus, you blessed it. That is the exact difference between a genuine leader and a political operator. A leader bends to the truth. An operator bends the truth to fit the schedule of the next news cycle. For 40 years, this country thought it was watching a leader. Some of us have started to wonder when exactly it was actually watching an operator. This morning is one way we are finding out. Here it was. The first time the analyst's icy calm had given way to something with a real edge in it. The room had grown incredibly quiet. Even Pelosi's tapping finger had stilled briefly on the leather memoir before starting up again. In the back of the gallery, Madam Speaker, there are 11 men and women in dark suits. Most of them didn't know each other before this morning. They are honorably discharged veterans of the armed forces of the United States. Some of them voted for you. Some of them have never voted for a Republican in their lives. They came today because they wanted to see what an Iraq War veteran would finally say to the woman who ran the chamber that smeared American veterans as agents of foreign governments. She did not turn to look at them. They are very patient men and women. They will wait. If you have ever sat at your kitchen table and felt like the serious elites in Washington were telling you a story that completely contradicted what you saw with your own eyes, this is the exact morning you have been waiting on. Subscribe right now. Because the next page is the page that was never supposed to come out of a folder. An aide leaned in aggressively toward Pelosi and whispered something fast, directly into her ear. For the very first time all morning, the speaker did not appear to hear a word of it. Tulsi opened the 4th tab. In October of 2019, the former Secretary of State of the United States, your former colleague and longtime ally, sat down for a podcast interview. During that recording, she described a sitting Iraq War veteran and active member of the United States House of Representatives as, quote, a Russian asset. The veteran was me, Madam Speaker. The interview is permanently in the public record. The exact transcript is in this folder. She slammed the page down. I want to say exactly what I am not doing right now. I am not asking you to answer for someone else's reckless words. I am not asking you to apologize for a podcast you were not on. I am asking about your absolute silence. She turned half a degree toward the cameras. Because for 6 consecutive years after that interview, you were the most senior elected Democrat in this country. You appeared on every major network. You gave thousands of statements, and you were asked repeatedly, on the record, whether you agreed with that characterization of a sitting American veteran by a member of your party. You blatantly declined to answer. You called it a matter for Secretary Clinton to address. You said you would not relitigate her comments. You said it was just a private exchange on a private podcast. It was absolutely none of those things. It was a toxic label applied by the most powerful Democrat of her generation to an American who had actually worn the uniform. And every single time you were asked, you coldly walked right past it. Tulsi did not raise her voice. That silence had a massive cost, Madam Speaker. Editors quoted it. Panelists repeated it. Primary opponents ran on it. That word followed me right into rooms I had bled to earn the right to enter. It cost me a presidential primary. It cost me the company of people who had fought beside me. You did not write the smear yourself. You were just the one singular person on this earth who could have ended it with one sentence on one Sunday morning. And in 6 agonizing years, you never did. The asset. The word landed for the second time, and the entire room felt the shockwave. And then Nancy Pelosi did the one thing she hadn't done all morning. She found her brutal footing. The conductor's hand came snapping back up off the memoir, and the legendary voice roared back with it. And for 30 blistering seconds, it was the raw, terrifying voice that had moved bills, broken rival speakers, and survived everything Washington could throw at her. I will not be lectured on loyalty by some junior officer who walked away from her own party the exact moment it cost her a primary. She fired back, the cadence heavy, full, and completely certain. I served this country long before you were even born. I shepherded the Affordable Care Act, kicking and screaming through this Congress on a razor-thin margin. You wouldn't have comprehended at 21. I built majorities. I lost majorities. And I rebuilt them. I never, not once, used the word asset to describe you, Director. I do not control the speech of every former colleague in my party. I will not be held responsible for the worst, unfiltered hot take of a podcast guest simply because you desperately needed a villain in a pantsuit to make the political math of your morning work out. And as for what is rotting on the rest of those pages, I can easily guess what is coming. My husband's financial investments are entirely public. They are completely legal. They are conducted strictly at arm's length from any committee work I have ever engaged in. I openly dare any prosecutor in this country, under any administration, to bring the criminal charge you are cowardly insinuating inside this room. I do not need the self-righteous lecture, Director. I have firmly earned the right not to take it. It landed with genuine force. The Democratic side of the panel emitted a sound low, almost a hum of sudden relief. A staffer standing directly behind Pelosi pulled his shoulders back. One of the younger members on the dais nodded sharply, then quickly caught himself. For about 30 tense seconds, the room suddenly remembered that this was Nancy Pelosi, and she had utterly destroyed much harder mornings than this one. Somewhere buried behind the press tables, a hushed voice said quietly, "She's not wrong about Hillary." And in that fleeting moment, she wasn't wrong about Hillary. And she wasn't wrong about the health care bill, and every breathing person in the room knew it. But Tulsi didn't flinch, not a millimeter. When a senior target finally throws the heavy counterpunch she has been loading all morning, a trained officer doesn't swing wildly back. She lets the room absorb the echo. Then she answers it. "Madam Speaker," she replied coldly, the second the heavy air cleared. "I did not say you used the word. I said you aggressively stayed silent on it. You were asked repeatedly. You were asked on national television. You were asked in print media. You were asked by reporters standing out in this very hallway. I have the exact transcripts. They are right here in this folder. Every single time, for 6 straight years, you explicitly declined to repudiate the use of that slur against an American veteran by a senior member of your party. You didn't have to control her speech. You just had to use your own, and you deliberately chose not to. That is not some random hot take, Madam Speaker. That is the meticulously recorded silence of the most powerful Democrat in the country for 6 solid years on a label pinned to a soldier. She slammed the page shut. And before you ask, Madam Speaker, I am not simply relying on my own memory. The verbatim transcripts of those questions are logged in this folder. So is the investigative article in Politico from December of 2019, where a reporter explicitly described asking your office for a clear statement and being abruptly told the Speaker had absolutely no comment. So is the taped segment from Meet the Press in February of 2020, where you were hit with the exact same question on live television and aggressively changed the subject. So is the official floor statement from August of 2021, where a member of your own caucus literally rose and demanded an answer to the same issue. And you hammered the gavel and ruled the question, your exact word, immaterial. The pattern is thoroughly documented. It is not the byproduct of one bad morning. It is 6 documented years cemented on the public record. If you have ever watched a wildly powerful person say absolutely nothing while a vicious smear they easily could have ended ran wild for years, share this video right now with anyone still waiting on a fake apology that is never coming. The speaker just proved to you exactly what those apologies actually sound like. In the back rows, 2 of the 11 military veterans slowly pushed themselves up from their chairs. They didn't utter a sound. They didn't step forward. They merely rose to their full height and planted themselves there. A heartbeat later, a 3rd veteran joined them. The armed Capitol Police officer stationed at the rear door simply watched and refused to intervene, because no technical rule had actually been broken. For the first time all morning, Nancy Pelosi's hand abandoned the conductor's beat permanently. It crashed down to rest on the leather memoir, fingers totally splayed apart, and stayed there. You just called this partisan, Madam Speaker. A bitter junior officer nursing a massive personal grievance. So let me openly grant you something. Tulsi intertwined her fingers over the closed folder. I have a massive personal grievance. I have stood at the brutal receiving end of that toxic word for 6 years straight. I absolutely will not pretend that anger isn't sitting right here in this room with us, but I am warning you right now that absolutely nothing printed on these pages requires my personal grievance to make it a reality. These pages were stone-cold truth long before I ever read them out loud. She locked her eyes forward. The initial set of dissents on the 2017 assessment was exposed in real time inside a book published by a journalist that literally nobody in this building could ever call a Republican operative. Glenn Greenwald, a man who built his entire career dismantling the covert security state and won a Pulitzer Prize doing exactly that. He wrote about this long before I was a candidate for anything. Matt Taibbi, a self-avowed leftist writer, has been relentlessly documenting the politicization of the intelligence cycle since the exact year you spearheaded your first impeachment circus. Mike Morell, who actually served as acting director of the CIA under President Obama, has openly acknowledged in public, fully on the record, that the infamous letter regarding the laptop in October 2020 was a manufactured political product, absolutely not a genuine intelligence product. Not a single one of these men takes a paycheck from me. Madam Speaker, none of them cast a vote for the man who appointed me. They all arrived at the exact same damning conclusions, because these documents arrived at those exact same damning conclusions before any of us even opened our eyes to it. Pelosi's shaking hand had not moved off the memoir. You spent 40 years operating in a town that taught you one miserable parlor trick. Whenever a question becomes too dangerous to answer, instantly make the person asking it into the actual story. Attack their political party, attack their hidden motives, attack their financial backers. You are lethally good at it. You trained the rest of your caucus to copy it. It is the absolute core tactic that built every defense of every disastrous morning you ever faced. But that cheap trick absolutely does not work against a hard mathematical number, Madam Speaker. And it totally shatters against a printed page dragged right out of your own classified briefing records. I am not the headline here. I never was. I am merely the authorized officer who happens to be holding the damn folder. The speaker muttered something back, almost too low for the live microphones to catch. You will get your brief moment in the sun, Director. These moments fade quickly. Tulsi stared straight back into her soul. So do political dynasties, Madam Speaker. The devastating line dropped into the room, and nobody dared laugh, because it absolutely was not meant as a joke. The aide stationed behind Pelosi stared frantically at her phone, and then straight down at the carpet. In the back row, 2 additional veterans rose to their feet. There were 5 of them standing tall now, entirely mute, and the armed Capitol Police officer at the doors casually crossed his hands in front of his belt, slightly shifting his weight. The unmistakable posture of a seasoned cop who had correctly read the room's temperature. A female staffer, sitting 2 chairs behind Pelosi, swiped open her phone, read a frantic text, and shut it off. She explicitly chose not to lean forward and whisper whatever disaster the message contained. She had internally decided the boss didn't need to be hit with that grenade just yet, and the legendary speaker, for the absolute first time all morning, hadn't bothered to ask. If a corrupt figure in your life has ever tried to convince you that the absolute truth was just another debatable opinion that elite people argue over until everyone simply gets exhausted, smash those notifications on right now, because the next document is the absolute smoking gun they have all been dodging for 38 years. Madam Speaker, Tulsi stated coldly, we have spent this entire morning arguing over intelligence assets. I would strongly prefer, with the remaining time the committee chairman has generously allotted me, to pivot to the other kind of assets. You first entered this legislative body in 1987, Madam Speaker. The official taxpayer salary at the moment of your election translated in modern inflation-adjusted dollars to roughly $174,000 annually. You have held power for 38 years. The brutal arithmetic of your lifetime government compensation is highlighted right here on the very first line of this new exhibit. She dragged a new page over. Your private household net worth, calculated by the absolute most conservative public estimates available on Wall Street, currently sits violently north of $200 million. That is not a number I am pulling out of thin air. That is a documented bracket published by nonpartisan financial institutions that track this data for a living. And that is just the bottom floor of their estimate. Many firms project it substantially higher. Nobody projects it lower. She let the massive canyon between those 2 numbers just rot in the air. Now, I am fully aware, Madam Speaker, that you did not amass that empire strictly off your taxpayer salary. Not a single breathing soul in this chamber is stupid enough to believe you did. That staggering household fortune is constructed almost entirely upon the highly aggressive stock trading activity executed by your husband, and those specific trades are a matter of brutal public record, purely because federal law mandates they be disclosed. Over the last fiscal year, his active portfolio, according to the published tracking of independent financial watchdogs who monitor congressional insider disclosures for a living, generated a massive return of roughly 70%. The benchmark S&P index returned approximately 24%, 70 against 24. 3 years prior to that exact same household portfolio yielded approximately 65%. The benchmark market returned roughly 19%. 70% is not a lucky break, Madam Speaker. It is not a hot streak at a casino. It is an impossible, mathematically shattered track record. The most ruthlessly consistent billionaire investor on earth, Warren Buffett, has managed to compound his wealth at roughly 20% across a grueling 60-year career. Yet your private household portfolio, coincidentally during the exact years you happen to be wielding the Speaker's gavel, routinely pulled in triple that margin. She began reading right off the hard print. Nvidia, Visa, Microsoft, Apple, Tesla. The targeted Nvidia trades alone, executed over the previous 48 months, hauled in massive 7-figure payouts. The most blatantly scrutinized among them was a massive leveraged purchase of $1 to $5 million strictly in Nvidia call options, executed in July of 2022, formally filed under your husband's legal name. It happened precisely 1 month before the exact Congress you personally commanded rammed through the most massive semiconductor corporate subsidy in American history. The perfectly timed visa trades aligned exactly by filing date, with intense congressional committee debates regarding payment processing regulations that would have directly impacted the corporation's revenue. None of this activity is being officially categorized as a federal crime in this folder, Madam Speaker, and none of it actually needs to be legally branded a crime for the American public to scream the obvious questions these actions demand. She ripped open another exhibit. And the problem isn't just the miraculous timing. It is the lethal direction. Your household's leveraged trades, the specific ones heavily scrutinized by the independent analysts staring at this wreckage, are correct in their market direction roughly 70% of the time. The average, hyper-educated Wall Street fund manager manages to beat the market less than half the time. Your household has flawlessly crushed it for years, utilizing massive positions formally filed within mere weeks of major legislative votes you personally controlled the schedule for. There is a very specific term for an individual who bets right, that consistently based on internal information that absolutely no one else in the world has access to yet. It is not called lucky. Pelosi's rigid hand finally twitched on the memoir, the index finger rising barely 1/4 of an inch, the conductor frantically trying to hijack the tempo just one final time. My husband is a deeply experienced, professional investor, director, who built his own massive financial career entirely independent of my political life for well over 50 years. He absolutely does not consult me regarding his stock trades, and I absolutely do not consult him regarding my legislative votes. The firewall constructed between our two households is a verified matter of public, legal record, aggressively audited by our legal counsel for every single year I have held a seat in this chamber. You can sit there and spew vile insinuations all morning, but you cannot legally prove a damn thing. There is a very specific reason no formal criminal charge has ever been brought against us. You are absolutely correct, Madam Speaker. 0 charges have been filed. Tulsi's eyes didn't drop for a second. The actual reason no criminal charge has been dragged into a courtroom is the exact same reason every single politician sitting in this building quietly smiles and understands. The currently existing statute simply does not strictly mandate what would desperately need to be proven. That is also a verified fact rotting in the public record. And it is the exact fact your political caucus repeatedly voted to protect and keep perfectly intact. Every single time, a brutal bill aimed at completely banning this exact style of insider trading managed to crawl its way onto the floor of your house. It died quietly right there. Yours is the exact chamber that aggressively built that phony firewall, and yours is the exact chamber that conveniently refused to lock the door behind it. Pelosi's shaking hand remained glued to the leather cover. You spent 38 years supposedly serving the public in this building on a middle-class government salary, yet you walked out of here hoarding a private fortune the size of a small commercial bank. The basic arithmetic simply does not add up, Madam Speaker. It has never added up. The math only magically works out if the actual work wasn't at all what the work pretended to be. She slammed the final document onto the wood. Just between us, you had the nerve to call me an asset. We just forcefully found yours. The absolute destruction of the mirror metaphor landed. The radioactive word, detonated for the third and final time, didn't require another breath. It was screaming from every single printed page on the desk. It was suffocating the leather notepad trapped under Pelosi's shaking grip. It was echoing wildly up in the gallery, where 8 out of the 11 combat veterans were now standing rigid on their feet. Tulsi kept the pressure pinned to the floor. And to the millions of voters watching this live feed right now at home, because they are exactly who this demolition was truly meant for. When the exact same woman who spent 40 straight years ordering you to blindly trust the corrupt institutions of Washington eventually struts out of this Congress vastly richer than the Wall Street bankers she was supposedly assigned to regulate, there is only one brutal question you are morally obligated to ask, and it is the exact same question she flat-out refused to answer today. Gabbard slowly pivoted, angling a quarter-degree directly into the broadcast cameras. How exactly does a taxpayer-funded public salary mutate into a multi-million-dollar private fortune? That is the definitive question. It isn't a partisan attack. It isn't a media hot take. It is a brutal, necessary question that every single constituent in this nation has the absolute right to shove down the throat of every single representative they have ever elected to this town. And until the response is something far better than arrogant silence, the job of purging the rot from this Capitol is absolutely not finished. For the first desperate time, Nancy Pelosi attempted to pull the ripcord she had successfully yanked in 1,000 other hostile rooms. She aggressively tried to pivot. With all due the familiar cadence sputtered, and the conductor's hand violently twitched a half-inch against the leather, completely failing to launch into the air. With all due, she stammered a second time, and the voice, the legendary patrician roar that had fiercely narrated 4 consecutive decades of American blood sport politics, suddenly thinned out into something fragile, hollow, and terribly small. The counterattack completely died in her throat. She desperately loaded a third attempt and pushed slightly further. Madam Director. It was the entirely wrong military title. She instantly realized it the second the words left her mouth. Her eyes frantically darted. Major. It was completely wrong again. Her legendary, razor-sharp procedural memory, the absolute armor she had dragged into this fight, was aggressively abandoning her on live television in front of every rolling camera in the Republic. She had dominated brutal rooms just like this one for more years than the interrogator across from her had literally been alive on this planet. And now, she could no longer even figure out the proper way to address her. Sergeant, the pathetic 4th attempt, didn't even make it to a verb. The trembling right hand clamped down brutally hard onto the leather pad, as if physically crushing it was somehow equivalent to standing tall, and it accomplished neither. The hot microphone picked up a faint, agonizingly dry swallow. Not a single human being in that chamber breathed or moved to rescue her. A screaming protester would have handed her an enemy to crush. A banging gavel would have provided a procedural escape hatch. Instead, the massive room just sat there. 200 people frozen in place, aggressively forcing the suffocating, humiliating silence to belong. For the very first time in 40 years, exclusively to her, there it is. There is the exact moment of destruction. Hit that like button one final time right now, because you literally just watched a 4-decade speaker lose the fundamental capacity to speak the correct title of the woman staring her down across the table. Tulsi finally pushed her chair back and stood up. It was the absolute first and only time she rose to her feet all morning, rising to her full, commanding height. The energy in the room seemingly gravitated entirely around her. She didn't waste another glance on Pelosi. She stared directly at the 19 individuals who were now standing completely upright at the very back of the spectator gallery. You men and women showed up this morning because you desperately needed to hear the filthy word you have been forced to live under. Dragged out into the light, she declared, her voice ringing loud across the chamber. It has been spoken now. It is permanently burned into the official record. There is absolutely nothing left for me to give you inside this room. She snapped the red folder completely shut. The rest of this mess belongs to the country now. The wooden gavel finally slammed down, and hours later, nobody in the press pool could actually pinpoint when the terrified chairman had even grabbed for it. This committee, The chairman choked out, his voice noticeably rattling over the audio feed. Will officially refer all financial disclosure matters to the Office of Government Ethics and the appropriate federal investigative authorities for immediate review. And the severe matter of the 2017 intelligence assessment process will be hurled to the Senate Select Committee for an aggressive closed-door session. We will immediately stand in recess. It was the stale, sterile language of parliamentary procedure. But inside that utterly dead room, it dropped like a federal prison sentence. Pelosi's veteran legal handler was instantly hovering at her shoulder, locking a tight grip onto her arm. The former speaker had completely abandoned trying to form a sentence. She shakily scooped up the leather notepad off the desk with both of her hands, moving incredibly slow. Seemingly incapable of figuring out which side of the table she wanted to place it back down on before just dropping it aimlessly right back where it started. All around the perimeter, the structured morning violently ripped apart in a chaotic series of micro-movements, which honestly looked far more devastating than a full-blown riot would have been. Two high-ranking Democratic politicians on the central panel instantly shot up from their chairs and sprinted for the exits, actively refusing to even glance in her direction. Three others remained completely glued to their seats, burning holes into their papers with their eyes, purely because there is a very specific type of political cowardice that looks exactly like a politician taking highly focused notes. The media rows aggressively cleared out, not instantly, but in desperate, crashing waves. Thumbs flying violently over screens, raw video clips being blasted out to editors long before a single writer actually typed up the formal story. At the rear of the viewing section, the original 11 combat veterans had somehow multiplied into 19, and they weren't just 19 anymore. Random spectators throughout the room had stood up and silently walked across the carpeting to flank them. Men and women wearing sharp corporate suits, a handful of them sporting tiny lapel pins that absolutely no one could decipher from the central dais. And they definitely were not all registered Republicans. By the very second, the shell-shocked chairman finally choked out the final words, declaring the recess. There were easily 30 human beings standing completely upright at the back wall, totally mute. And that deafening silence was easily the loudest damn thing happening inside the entire building. A young journalist scrambling near the press exit muttered, almost unconsciously to himself, "She never actually answered the question." He breathed it out, the exact way a human being vocalizes a horrific realization. The split second, the math clicks in their brain. About the massive stock trades, she never gave an answer. She just fed us the prepackaged speech. She totally dodged the answer. A grizzled, older correspondent, standing right next to him, a veteran reporter who had tracked Pelosi's brutal career since the early days of the second Bush administration, simply watched as the battered speaker fumbled for her heavy coat and leaned heavily on her lawyer. He didn't speak for a very long time. Then, barely whispering, he said, "She used to do this exact thing to other people." The agonizingly slow questioning, the damning folder, the crushing psychological weight. He shook his head grimly. It is a profoundly bizarre thing, watching her get completely butchered on the receiving end of it. Out in the marble corridors, 3 former high-level political operatives who had previously served directly under the speaker, men and women who had literally forged their entire Washington careers, clinging to her shadow bluntly refused, on the permanent record, to defend a single second of the slaughter that had just occurred. One of them leaked, strictly off the record, that the explosive household trading spikes had deeply embarrassed the central office for over a decade, but that absolutely nobody in her inner circle possessed the spine to say it straight to her face. The reporter who caught the leak aggressively typed it down and realized he didn't have to make a single follow-up phone call to verify it. Tulsi was already aggressively jamming the empty red folder back into a rugged, unbranded leather briefcase. She hadn't cracked a single smile the entire morning. She absolutely wasn't smiling now. A junior intelligence analyst from her personal detail leaned in close and quietly reported that the raw video feed of the brutal exchange was already detonating across social media platforms faster than any piece of footage the command office had ever launched in its history, moving faster than their servers could even accurately measure. The director merely gave a slight nod, exactly the way a battlefield commander acknowledges a meaningless weather report. But right before she turned to walk away, she paused, right at the edge of the wooden witness desk. She turned her shoulders back toward the rapidly emptying chamber and delivered the one definitive statement the viewing gallery would drag home and violently repeat long after they had forgotten the details of a single declassified document. "For a long moment," she said, "a massive chunk of you watching this have carried a sickening feeling in your gut that the corrupt elites in this town, who endlessly demanded your blind trust, had secretly bought themselves a private luxury country club using your stolen tax dollars while you were completely distracted by other issues. You were absolutely right. You were never crazy conspiracy theorists. You were absolutely not the deplorables. You were not uneducated peasants who simply failed to comprehend how high-level Washington mechanics operate. You were the ones who truly understood the hustle, and you were aggressively told you were far too simple to be given a voice." She locked eyes with the entirely vacant chair, sitting dead across the table. "That is the absolute reality I came here to burn into the permanent record this morning, not destroying a singular person, but destroying a toxic habit. The arrogant habit of being lectured that the cheap theatrical costume of public service is identical to the actual grueling substance of it. It absolutely is not. The taxpayer's salary is not the multi-million-dollar fortune. The polished political cadence is not the brutal truth. And nobody, no matter how politically entrenched, no matter how ruthlessly gifted, gets to burn 4 decades, casually destroying other Americans by calling them foreign assets, and then act completely shocked on the morning somebody finally kicks open the locked vault on her own operation." She hoisted the heavy leather case. "The mission is not over. The locked folders are absolutely not sealed. There are many other corrupt rooms. There are many other protected names. We will be kicking the doors down in all of them, and then executing the precise, cold mechanics of an officer who simply had another crucial appointment to keep." She marched straight down the side of the wooden dais. She vanished into the long corridor, merged into the ordinary, echoing noise of a Wednesday inside the Hart Senate office building, and was completely gone before the stunned room had even finished processing what it had just witnessed. Left behind her on the scarred witness desk, a leather memoir containing 40 years of political invincibility sat tightly shut, and a violently shaking conductor's hand remained pinned on top of it, completely incapable of moving. By exactly 200 p.m., the Speaker's defensive perimeter had launched a frantic, heavily worded statement. Baseless. A highly politically motivated hit job, a malicious revenge operation orchestrated by a rival administration that had obsessively craved her public humiliation for years. The husband's aggressive market investments, the desperate memo highlighted, were entirely public, completely legal, and formally disclosed under federal law. It was a highly polished, aggressive countermeasure, and it would have worked flawlessly, the exact same way every single statement before it had worked. Except for one brutal, unavoidable reality. The entire country had already watched the raw footage. In the unedited video, the single most rhetorically lethal woman in modern American political history had been completely paralyzed, utterly unable to choose the correct title for the officer sitting across the table. A stack of highly paid PR words pumped out on official letterhead could not magically erase the deafening, humiliating silence of that broadcasted room. By the time evening arrived, the The brutal clip of the completely botched pivot had been ripped and rewatched more times than any piece of congressional video in the entire history of the building. The desperate political loyalists forcefully kept their defense sentences incredibly short. The aggressive critics relentlessly slammed the 70 and 24 market figures side by side, blasting it on an endless loop. Zero formal criminal charges had actually been leveled yet. The elite legal commentators smugly reminded their shrinking audiences of this technicality, which was factually true, and which absolutely no longer mattered to anyone breathing. Because the horrific damage that broke inside that committee room was absolutely never going to be settled inside a sanitized courtroom, inside a cramped, modest home out in Killeen, Texas. A scarred Army combat veteran who had survived 2 grueling tours in the Iraqi desert stared at his screen. He watched the viral segment covering the 11 silent men and women standing in the back of the gallery. He watched the group swell to 19, and he watched it explode to 30. He didn't speak a single word to his wife about it. He just sat entirely alone at his kitchen table for a long, silent, while after she had gone to bed, and then quietly switched off the overhead light. Up in Reading, Pennsylvania, a worn-out woman managing the grueling early breakfast shift at a local diner watched her husband aggressively pull up the live stock price for Nvidia on his cracked phone screen while she poured out the morning coffee. He just stared at the impossible trajectory, then slammed the phone down on the counter. Neither of them had ever bought a single share of stock in their entire lives. They had faithfully paid into their dying pension fund every 2 weeks for 30 straight years. She didn't say a word to him. There was absolutely nothing left to say. Out in San Francisco, a mid-level financial analyst operating at a regional bank, a woman who had loyally punched the ticket for Nancy Pelosi every single time her name ever materialized on a voting ballot since she turned 22 years old, watched the brutal collapse on her phone while eating lunch. She didn't even bother finishing her sandwich. She just sat there, both of her hands pressed completely flat against the table for a massive amount of time. And what she was feeling wasn't exactly white-hot anger. It was the horrific, sickening quiet of realizing she had just burned 30 years of her life, fiercely defending someone who, it was now violently obvious, had never spent a single second defending her back. The intelligence director refused every single media interview request that afternoon. When a desperate reporter finally cornered her in a dimly lit marble hallway late that night and shouted out what exactly she had hoped to accomplish, she delivered one final, freezing quote. She simply stated that a woman had spent 40 entire years viciously naming other people's assets and had just been profoundly surprised this morning to finally be interrogated about her own. If the cold reality of this confrontation violently resonated with a truth you've been forced to carry for years, smash the like button and subscribe so the absolute truth keeps finding you. And drop a name in the comments right now to tell us exactly whose classified file needs to get kicked wide open next.